Welcome back to another episode of the SaaS Buyers Club. I'm your host, Omeed.
And I'm your co-host, Joe.
And this week, I'm really excited to have Alan Rodriguez on our podcast. Alan is a former director at LegalZoom with, I believe, lawyer services. He'll tell you a little bit more about that. He runs a marketing company called 1-400. He owns a law firm in Arizona. He's a non-attorney that owns a law firm in Arizona, which is super cool. Want to definitely ask you about that. And he's also an investor and entrepreneur in the legal tech SaaS space and tech space generally. Did I get that right, Alan? Was that like a good?
That was great. Thank you. Excited to be here.
Yeah. Yeah. So what would you fill in other, like what kind of color can you add to what I've said?
Yeah, just I think you've kind of said most of my professional experience. I think one thing that I like to share is like I've not been a serial entrepreneur all my life, right? I had this career where I worked at other places, so I'm kind of a late start entrepreneur. And my point in sharing that is it's never too late, right? Like as long as you have this desire, just kind of go for it and pursue that journey, throw your hat in the ring. The other thing I would say, I'm sure we're going to kind of talk about this here in a second, but like on the acquisition side, I've also not had a whole lot of training kind of doing that, right? Like I didn't come from a family of like a family, private family office or parents that had that. I just kind of met the right people, jumped in there, let my curiosity lead me down this path. And I've also got a late start, but I did it. So it can be done.
For someone who doesn't have the entrepreneurial experience, you definitely have dived into so many oceans. Like, tell us, okay, I definitely want to touch on the fact that you are a law firm owner, because this is a big deal. Like, for those of the audience that don't know, but for the longest time, if you were not or are not a lawyer, you could not own or have any interest in a law firm. But there are some states now that are actually changing that practice and are letting what are called non-attorneys own law firms. And Alan, do you know how many people like in Arizona had bought a law firm at the time? Were you one of the first, or what's the deal?
Somebody explained this to me. I was the first Mexican-American majority, non-attorney majority shareholder in America to ever own a law firm, right? So I was first in, like, you have to multi-layer the categories to like be the first, but like so somebody shared that with me, and that's cool. I'll take it, right? But I think when my application was approved, I think there were like 6 other people that weren't law firms. Like there's 2 types of entities in Arizona. There's like, you can be a business entity, like just a regular old LLC, and then hire a lawyer to provide legal services, or you can be a law firm and then have non-attorney ownership, which is the path that I went down. And I believe when I applied, I was like number 2 in that category, maybe number 3. But there had been like 6 total the other category as well. So it's pretty early on. Yeah, pretty early on.
And so you started it from the ground up. You started it from scratch.
Yeah. So, I think the normal trajectory for a law firm is like you graduate, you're a lawyer, you graduate from law school, you get a job somewhere to kind of learn the trade, right? And you cut your teeth doing whatever that law firm is kind of doing. And then you get tired of doing it their way, and you're like, I'm going to start my own practice. Right? And maybe you take a book of business with you. Some of the clients, they're like, I just want to work with Omeed and Joe. Like, like I sure you guys were at this law firm, but I have a relationship with you. And so they follow you there. Well, I don't have that, right? I'm not a lawyer. I can't practice. Don't have a desire to practice. So when we launched Singular Law, it was just like, okay, what do I need to do? I need my first customer. So the first thing I needed was like to be able to fulfill the product. And oftentimes you'll hear me talk about services as products, because I think it changes our mindset and it allows us to kind of be more innovative in how we deploy them. So I needed to be able to fulfill or sell my product. So I needed an attorney to do that. So through my network, through connections of, having served the industry for 24 years, I knew lots of innovative people, just like I've met you and Joe, two innovative lawyers doing this thing. I met Scott Griffiths and Mary, and we're like, hey, here's what I want to do. Here's what I'm good at: building products, using technology to improve customer experience, right? The whole operational side and automation of law. That's the stuff that I can do. Now I need somebody to actually give great legal advice, right, to people. And so they stepped up. We figured out some, partnership structures and made all that work. And then we just went out and looked for our first customer using the internet, like Google search, paid ads, Facebook. And yeah, started doing it that way.
That's so cool. And you also own a market. Well, I mean, it's convenient that you also own a marketing company for law firms as well. So
yeah, so I'll give you the full, like, what I was trying to do here, right? So let me step back and kind of talk about Amazon for a little bit. So Amazon starts off as just e-com, right? Specifically books, then just e-com. But then they figured, like, hey, we've got like expenses that we can maybe leverage for other products. And so, like, in Amazon's case, they started selling AWS. Like they built like all these servers, and that was an expense for them. But they're like, how do we turn this expense into money? And then they also had to figure out logistics. So they started their own logistics companies, and they own everything in their vertical, like everything in their vertical, right? Like from acquisition all the way to the time it ends up in your door. And then they're even in your house, right? With like Alexa products. So, kind of thinking about that, I was like, okay, well, I have this marketing company. How can I start creating the same verticals, right? Well, in my case, when you run a law innovation agency like 1-400, you spend a lot of time convincing lawyers to sell products or to build subscription plans. And you spend all that time. And I was like, why don't I just get my own law firm? I don't have to convince anybody else to do it. I'll just do it. And I'll earn that vertical. So now, like, I own the acquisition part of acquiring, people who have a need for legal services. And now I own the fulfillment side, right? And then, like, on the technology side, I needed to own that too. And that's where we get to Simple Client. So I'm really trying to set up everything in my vertical. And so my interest in businesses are always within the category that I know, legal services. That's what I'm an expert at. I'm not trying to, set up like a cupcake franchise or something like that. Like, I don't know anything about that business. So I am looking for a variety of business opportunities, but always within my vertical and always in some way where it's going to complement the other businesses in my portfolio. One of the acquisitions that I also did last year is I acquired a competitor, Divorce Marketing Group. And, why did that make sense? Well, now I have an existing book of business that was already generating revenue and was profitable, and I just get to add it to my portfolio. And so I can leapfrog my growth by just acquiring other businesses in that category. So anyway, that's why I have what seems like really varied businesses, right? Like SaaS company, marketing agency, a law firm, but not really when you kind of think about like the Amazon kind of alignment, right? Like that's by design. I'm trying to accomplish that.
Yeah, and you're not only going for it, I mean, you're doing it. How many companies have you acquired? So you've acquired one law firm, it sounds like, and one SaaS company. Is that right?
Yeah. So the law firm was more of a startup. I didn't really acquire them, right? Like, technically speaking, just added them to my portfolio as a startup. But the acquisition was Simple Client, the SaaS company. That was formerly Client Rock. We rebranded it as Simple Client now. And then the other company that I acquired was Divorce Marketing Group. And part of that acquisition was not just acquiring its book of business. They had also done a pretty good job of creating some digital assets that were high value. For example, over time, they owned an asset called Family Lawyer Magazine, and they built this list of family law lawyers throughout America, like 39,000 family lawyers, into this really robust and really active mail list. And for me, that was just as interesting, because when the cost of like legal marketing, or the cost of acquisition of hiring a lawyer, getting a lawyer to pay for 1-400 services is really high. There's a lot of competition in my space. But by acquiring this company, I can acquire a list of people who have been engaged with this list forever. And now I use it as an asset to market my services more effectively. So again, only 2 acquisitions technically, but very strategic in my choice. Not just like, hey, this looks like an interesting business and the price is right. It's more like, you know, how is this going to benefit my portfolio of other businesses?
I see. And I have a whole host of questions about what you're doing there. It sounds interesting, and it sounds great. Before, though, we were to dive into any more detail, is there anything else we should step out about and do more of a background introduction for you on, Alan? If, for example, any other projects or acquisition interests that you have?
You know, I'm looking for more opportunities in the legal plan space. So like some of you might have heard this described as legal insurance, but anything in the subscription legal services space. I've got a project right now. It's legalbrave.com.
Okay.
Started off doing some consulting work, and then we've moved into a consulting for equity type of position where I become a shareholder in a variety of companies. So sometimes it isn't like acquiring an entire business, but maybe a portion of one by leveraging the expertise that you have, right? So I tend to think of M&A as more than just that traditional transaction, right? Like you have a seller and a purchaser, right? Like you can also purchase fractional ownership, right? Like in one as well. And so right now I'm working with a couple of legal subscription services where they can leverage my product expertise. I've done a lot of work in the subscription law space, very familiar with that. And yeah, so those are the projects that are interesting for me.
I see. Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. So you have this giant legal conglomerate you're building.
I'm trying.
I'm seeing that, and also consultancy for equity, etc., related services within the legal marketplace.
And if I can touch on that, I'll tell you, like, you guys know this from your line of work. You got to be passionate about what you do, right? Like you got to really enjoy it, like, because you have tough days, and the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning, it's like, you know, like I really got to, I've committed to doing this thing. I got to do this thing. For me, that's access to justice. And, you know, I've been involved in the access to justice movement since I've started my career, way back at the LA County Bar days. And I'll tell you, 80 million Americans every year go with either inadequate or no access to justice in America. Though we have the highest per capita number of lawyers in all of America. We have one lawyer for every 330 Americans, right? Like, you know, we have about 1.3 million lawyers, about 330 million Americans, right? But even though we have all that, like 80% of litigated, like family law is a category, 80% of litigated family law matters, there's one party that's unrepresented. And to me, that's broken. And so as the entrepreneur, I'm going to talk about this here for a second, is as an entrepreneur, there's an entire population of people, 80 million, in fact, who are being ignored by the current legal system. Like if I could get $2 out of every one of those 80 million people, that's an amazing business, right? And so legal subscription services reduce the barrier of entry financially for most people. They create recurring revenue for law firms or legal plan entities. And it's a win-win. Everybody gets better access to justice. So for me, I want to do business, but I also want to do good in the world. So that's what keeps me going. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning.
No, that's awesome. And so I see part of that there is a passion, but also part of that there is a huge industry problem, right? That we all see every day, and legal services are expensive. And so what are some other ways that you're able to solve for that problem and offer cheaper services, or like you're saying with legal plans? That's really cool. I definitely want to dive into that. Omeed, I'll throw the mic over to you though. Do you have anything to mention at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, just as a context piece, Alan, you came into contact with the recognition. It sounds like you have a long history with lawyers. So you started at the LA County Bar, you know, you were at LegalZoom. I think that's where you kind of realized the access to justice piece.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I realized it at the LA Bar, right? Because like there, I ran the lawyer referral and information service, and like we would get, I don't know, north of 100,000 calls a year, right? Like of people needing some legal help. And just a quick example, like somebody who has a non-injury auto accident, you're not going to find a lawyer to help you with that. But that's an access to justice problem. We'd get lots of those calls. People just need some guidance. Hey, work this out with your insurance, or file, you know, like many states have like a fund and stuff like that, right? Like uninsured motorists. So that's where I realized this. And then I would talk to lawyers and they're like, you know, somebody should really fix this problem, but unfortunately up to $450 an hour or $500 an hour, like, and I'm busy, I can't do it, right? And so I was just thinking like, there's just an opportunity there. At LegalZoom, I got to put it into practice though, right? Because we use software to do a lot of the heavy lifting. And then my job was to kind of figure out where attorneys fit in that model. And that's all I did for 4 years. And we created all of these wonderful attorney fulfilled products. And now LegalZoom is valued at $2 billion, you know, and from 2008 to 2012, we kind of like just slingshot it because people want to work with lawyers. Lawyers just haven't figured out how to create scalable systems to deliver legal services to them.
That's interesting. And there's also, I mean, there's also a long history past of, you know, lawyers being happy with the way things are, and lawyers having control of the, you know, the licensure and the, you know, California, it's extremely hard to pass the bar.
Yeah.
I think the rule was when I passed the bar was you look to your right and left and one of you was going to pass.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Which was funny in a scary way, because you're just like, oh, it's kind of like a little horror film. And then just think about, you know, how that affects onwards the access to those services. That's really great there. It really makes me want to talk to you about your SaaS business and stuff you're working on now or working on in the future to help solve for that problem. But maybe we can get into that a little bit later in the conversation. For now, why don't we kind of take a step back and talk more about your experience with your 2 acquisitions and maybe some lessons learned or some stories that you have related to that I think would be really on point, especially with the SaaS business, but also with the marketing business. I think both those would be really great sources of information that we could mine out. Does that sound like a good way to proceed, you guys?
Yeah, I love it.
Okay, let's do that. I mean, which one did you do first of the 2? Was it the marketing or the SaaS acquisition?
It was the SaaS company first.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what motivated it. So again, I was doing a lot of work in the subscription space, and I knew that there wasn't a good software solution to allow law firms to just offer subscriptions to their customers. So I actually started building one, and the original version was called Fixie Plans. And this, you know, my company wasn't built for SaaS. And so I was struggling very hard to kind of change some of that culture, start adding more team members dedicated to that effort, that sort of thing. And it was just taking me a long time. And my roadmap looked like I was going to be a few $100,000 in before I had an MVP that I can bring to the market. So while I was doing that, some, you know, software engineer by the name of Brian created a product called Client Rock. And I chatted with him, and there was some overlapping features. It was, you know, there's some different functionality that I hadn't intended to build, but there was some overlapping features specifically on the subscription recurring payment system, and then on a client portal. And I just reached out to him. I was like, hey, you know, how are you enjoying this? Whatever. And turns out that he's a really great engineer, like a very thoughtful, like product person, but he had never sold to lawyers, and he never knew like how difficult that is, like how tech backwards a large part of the industry is. I hate generalizing, but like you guys are lawyers, you know this, you know, from your prior work. And so like all the tech support and you know, and I had told Brian, like I heard him complaining about these key points, and I was like, I could solve that for you. And he was like, what do you mean? I was like, why don't you just give me the business and you just be an engineer? That's all he wanted to do, right? It was like, you know, lawyers that start their own firms, all they wanted to do is be lawyers. They don't want to be like HR managers, payroll managers, bookkeepers, right? Same, right? And so he was like, interesting. He was like, let me think about it. Ghosted me for a bit. And it turns out that somebody else had proposed the same, a much bigger player and known player than me.
Can you say who?
I can't.
Okay.
But very well recognized in the legal industry. But cool.
How did you find Brian? I hear that you just like reached out to him, but you weren't like looking. Were you like, are there any other solutions that are similar than mine? Like,
yeah, I was checking out my competition, really. Okay. But I'll tell you where the M&A part came in. Meanwhile, right, like I had this lawyer, prospective client, came in. This guy was like a genius. He had been a lawyer for only like 2 years. And he had already had 3 lawyers working for him. And then he was like going to employ 5 more. And he was growing really fast. And he was like talking about buying this sign on a building or whatever. I was like, what? This is crazy. You've only been practicing 3 years. This is like an amazing success story. Like, how do you do it? His previous job, he's second career lawyer. His previous job was working M&A for Verizon. And his job was to go and find small, like, cell tower repair companies or whatever and acquire them for Verizon to expand their service reach and things like that. Okay. And so he just knew how these M&A deals got put together. He had it so dialed in. He was just part of that team. And so he was growing, but like he didn't necessarily want to practice. He just wanted to run the business of law. So he was acquiring all these law firms.
What kind of law firms?
Business, family, estate planning, like whatever. He was just like, he wanted to be a full service firm. And I was like, how can you afford to do that? He was like, I rarely pay out of pocket. Because he had the knowledge of all this creative financing, the way you carve out certain assets and, you know, you kind of the art of the deal, right? Like that's the big part of the M&A. It's like learning that. Once you learn that part of it and you develop that skill, like, man, it opens up a whole lot of opportunity, right? For you as an investor and as an acquirer. So anyway, this guy inspired me and I was like, you know, I'm going to try it. I'm gonna try. So like I'm talking to, you know, Client Rock, whatever. And I was like, I don't know, let's see where this goes. Are you interested? And he was like, yeah, maybe. Ghosted me for a while, entertained this other offer. That deal fell through. So my offer went from this down to, you know, like from one number way down to a much lower number. Just based on some of these other people that have done this for a living. And we negotiated some terms and I said, look, it's going to cost me, you know, $250,000 to build my product, or I can acquire this one for a fraction of the price. No brainer.
Were there any other, was it just a straight purchase price, like a payment, or were there any other parts of the terms of the deal?
Yeah. So the seller had a really great client that was basically his only revenue generator. And so to kind of sweeten the deal a little bit, I was like, well, why don't I buy everything and then I'll license you back a limited use license to continue to service this customer. So now you actually just have passive revenue, right? So that way we get the price way down, right? Like you keep the only revenue generator and I'll take over everything else. But it's only good for that one client. So that way he's not competing with me in the future, you know, that sort of thing. But that was one of the ways that we were able to negotiate. And like for him, that was great. It was like an easy customer. It was good revenue for him. It was passive mostly, you know, maybe an hour or two support once a month. But for me, the benefit was like, you know, really pulled the price down.
That's really creative. I like the way you approach that with, and I bet you really appreciated that from just a good faith sort of work together perspective, you putting that out there. Okay, so I'm understanding that deal. When did that one close?
I think it was like December of last year.
Okay, December of last year. Did you have to have them start building out other features, or really, or how did you go from there, from the time of acquisition? Are there any, I mean, we don't need to like know all the details.
Yeah.
maybe you could...
We like details though, and we like stories too, you know.
To the degree that I'm happy to share.
Sure, yeah. But tell us a little bit about how it went from there. Were there any obstacles you encountered on the integration process that could be lessons learned for first-time buyers or for founders out there?
Yeah, so I think every seller wants to wash their hands when they're finally ready to sell. They're like either burnt out, they want to retire, they, you know, maybe there was like a death in the family, whatever. Like 80% of small businesses, by the way, in America just die. They just go away, right? Like they just like the business owners think, oh, my kids are going to take over the business. They're, you know, the business owner works their butt off, you know, with whatever porta potty rental business that's generating $250,000 a year, and then kids go off to, you know, Stanford or something, and they become, you know, whatever. They work an entire industry and they're like, hey, thanks, Dad, but I don't really want to take over the business. Or they become musicians or whatever, right? Like, and so then Dad or mom just work until they don't want to work anymore. And then they tell their employees like, hey, I'm tired. We're going to close, you know, or they die on the whatever, right? So there's tons of opportunity out there. Now, getting back to your question about the integration, right? Like, what you don't want to do is like just say you just go away. I mean, there's probably some cases for that, but you got to remember a lot of these businesses are being run usually by some kind of custom operation. Not every small business is like using the EOS model, entrepreneurial operating system, or like whatever, right? Like, you know, any of these kind of, they don't have the operations dialed in. So you really need somebody to kind of walk you through like the what ifs and that. So what I did in my case, it's like, hey, look, we're going to do this deal, but you're going to stay on for 6 months. Well, you're going to do the integration from your back end to our back end, right? It's basically creating a new AWS account, creating all the stuff that drives SaaS, right? So you're going to do that part of the deal, right? So that way, and then in the process, you're going to allow my engineer to shadow you to learn what it takes to kind of set that up. And then you're going to provide a couple of hours of support for the next 6 months, you know, a couple of hours per month. And then after that, you'll still make yourself available, but we'll pay you as a consultant, you know, $250 an hour or something. Right. And so that way he has an incentive to kind of stick around and help succeed. The other thing too, is like when we were structuring the payments, the fee, I gave them some, you know, like 50% up front, then 25% on some milestone, like, hey, functioning, right? And then 25% on like plus 2 months to make sure that we identified any bugs that were unreported or something like that. So that way, again, you know, he's sticking around. He's not like just taking off. So that's very important when you're acquiring a business, is because otherwise the seller, they're just hoping like, give me $1 million and then I'll just go away. I'll just go to the beach. You know what I mean? So you got to think through that for sure.
Yeah, that's really thoughtful there. And sorry to hog the mic, Omeed. I'll throw it back over to you. But that's really thoughtful there. And I'm also sensing here that you have a great capacity to talk to technical-minded founders, such as the engineer in this case, and also understand some of the issues that arise if you're buying a SaaS or if you're buying a software business. Because I really like what you're saying you did there about having a payment occur 2 months after the integration was supposed to occur. So you could really be sure that, okay, everything's functioning properly. Because there's always, you know, little things, little bugs here and there, especially if it's a new integration out of the gate. And it sounds like you were able to do the deal and really get what you wanted out of it and bake that into the terms to secure what you wanted. A lot of people, sadly, kind of just pray or hope, like, I'm going to pay and we're going to get the integration later. Well, in this case, an actual software integration, though when I was using the word, I was referring to, like, you know, the M&A sense of the word integration. And there's a lot of prayer going on is what I'm trying to get at there. So I really like what you did. I think that's very thoughtful.
Yeah, I would suggest to people that are doing their first M&A, it's like, well, one, ideally you'd have some knowledge of like the industry you're entering, right? Like you don't want to try to go into healthcare if you've never done that. It's highly regulated, or like, you know, whatever, right? Like, you know, fintech, for example, if you've never done that, there's a whole set of regulations you also have to be aware of. But I think it's possible to acquire some business where maybe you don't have deep expertise, but you hire an operator, right? Like, so you have somebody that does have the expertise that you could delegate and ask to perform, you know, the transfer, right? And kind of be there to monitor. In my case, I have a lot of product and technology expertise, so I'm able to communicate directly, you know, with the SaaS founders to figure out what their tech stack is, to anticipate whether or not we'll be able to support it, what additional costs we'll have to kind of incur, you know, as part of the migration. But absent that, then maybe just find a partner, you know, or a temporary consultant, hire an operator, like somebody, like you acquire a business and say, hey, I'm going to rev share with you. You know, you're going to keep 10%, but you're going to run this business and report to me, you know, something like that. You know, this is the best way to do it, maybe.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Omeed, why don't I give you a chance?
Awesome. Yeah. So Alan, I hear that the way that you acquired the SaaS business was you met this like rock star that was like previously Verizon on the M&A team, you know, understood the art of M&A, had like significantly grown his law firm in a very short amount of time using, you know, M&A strategy. That kind of inspired you to be like, well, I'm going to do that too. And that's how you came across the SaaS business. And I hear that the way that you found the SaaS business to acquire was you were researching competitors. What was it like reaching out to that founder at first? Like, how did you position yourself? Like, you know, I heard you say that you reached out, you're like, hey, how are things going? And over time, what you learned was this person had a pain point around things that were not engineering focused, like is so true for so many technical founders. But what did that conversation actually even sound like when you initially reached out to them?
Yeah, I think originally I might have sent him a LinkedIn connect and say, hey, you know, we're both operating in the legal tech space and would like to expand my network and jump on a call. Like, you know, I think every deal or opportunity that I've ever come across has been through my network, right? Been through having conversations with people. And so for me, I force myself to do that regularly. I attend conferences, even though, you know, I don't necessarily enjoy spending time away from my family, but, you know, it's just the nature of the work. If you're not out there talking to people, seeing facial expressions and kind of getting to know them, you'll never find, you know, these opportunities. That said, I do know some people send out postcards, direct mailers. Hey, are you interested in selling your business? And a lot of people have success with that. But for me, I'm looking for very specific targeted people like in my vertical. So it was LinkedIn, just like, hey, let's connect. We jumped on a Zoom. We chatted. I think it was,
but you weren't necessarily looking to acquire his business at the time or thinking about that. Yeah. It just happened super organically.
Yeah. It's just like a separate conversation was with this lawyer that I told you about. And then I realized after my conversation with this guy, I was like, I got to call him back and I'm just going to see where this goes. And so now I'm just coming off of this 9-day, you know, speaking tour, right? Like, you know, these conferences. I met a business at a Clio conference and, you know, he was one of the vendors and I happened to have seen him at previous conferences and I was like, hey, how's the business going? It's probably, you know, like you've been here a couple of years, it's probably going. And he had this look on his face where like, you know, I'm starting to get a little tired. Like it's good, but I don't think I'm the right guy to take it next level. And there was all the signs, right? Like, you know, and I just hit him with it there, you know, like on the spot. It was like, sounds like maybe you be open to selling it. And he's like,
bold.
You know, I never really thought about that, but like, I'm a business person. Yeah, let's have that conversation. And so now I've got his business card here. I'm going to give him a call and we'll see if it makes sense. You know, I mean, like, so, and that's just how it works for me.
Yeah, the natural organic unfolding in that way. And it sounds like it happened for that first SaaS acquisition that same way. And just to kind of recap, because there are like a little bit of details that I'd like to fill in there. It sounds like you reached out to him, messaged him on LinkedIn, you know, hey, let's check in. We both are kind of building similar products.
Yeah.
You know, have an initial conversation with them. You hear kind of that first little signal of like, oh, this person might be, you know, that first flag. Yeah. Oh, they're not happy. You know, he's having a tough time with sales. Oh, that's what I'm good at. I'm like really good at, you know, the sales part of things and the marketing part of things. And so did you just go for it that time too? Were you just like, well, why don't you just sell your business to me?
Yeah, it's a little like I don't exactly say it that way. Like what ends up now I'll try to explain what I mean, because it happens pretty organically.
Sure.
They disclose some problems that they're facing in their business, right? And what I try to do is solve that problem. And so sometimes solving that problem is an acquisition. Sometimes it's the consulting for equity deal where I acquire some percentage of the company to help solve the problem, right? But if you would imagine, you use the same skill of like M&A, right? Like to acquire equity positions in various companies, one of them is going to hit, right? This is what VC does, but you could do it as a small business owner. So it's really focusing on what's the problem. And in the simple client case, the problem was the discovery that like selling to lawyers and working on tech projects for lawyers wasn't as exciting as the person thought it would be. So that problem was like, hey, let's acquire. In another case, it might be like the problem might be I want to retire, or the problem might be I don't know how to get more money out of my business, right? And so if you could acquire, say, a business that's already generating revenue and then take it to the next level, like maybe that person actually becomes an employee or a minority shareholder, and now they're making more money and kind of doing the work, right? You know, so it's like, you really just got to go and find out what people are suffering from, what business owners are suffering from, and then try and solve that for them if you're interested, obviously.
Yeah, and if you have if it's in your wheelhouse too, which I'm seeing here. I have a few follow-up questions, Omeed, but you were about to say something.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, here's one of them. Okay, now I'm gonna have to pick between them to get the first one out. But I'll go ahead and go with this one. So moving forward, are you thinking about acquiring more products, features from other SaaS targets, or are you thinking about development in-house, or is this something that you're thinking about both?
I think both is the answer. And again, looking at my portfolio of businesses, so like growing the law firm, I mean, this guy inspired me. Like, what's the fastest way to grow? Is just acquire more law firms, right? And small law firms are notoriously like overworked and underpaid, right? Because it's so hard, you know, like being the service provider and being the manager and being the business development person, all the stuff, right? And so sometimes lawyers like, look, I went to law school to just really help people, but I spend 80% of my day doing all this other BS, right? Can I say bullshit, or is that too much? Okay, all right. So like, I spend my time doing this other bullshit, right? Like, I just want to service people. And so it's like, hey, we can solve that problem for you. Why don't you come in, right? Like, we'll take over your portfolio business. We'll get a paralegal, like sign, we'll do the marketing, the branding, all the stuff. And you just service people, right? Like, you just do the thing and you'll earn more, right? So people aren't really giving up like independence, you know, and all that sort of thing. Like they're taking on more income. So I think there's both. And so on the law firm, I'm going to grow that, acquire more law firms. But on the SaaS, we have a product roadmap and a feature set. And if somebody's got like some code or some logic, like sometimes we don't have to acquire the entire other business. We could just acquire the code base or the logic base. Sometimes just to expand everybody's thing. Like the other thing that I'm interested in acquiring is like Facebook groups.
Oh,
right? Like, I mean, think about it, right? Like, so
so
acquisition doesn't always have to be like, I'm going to tie this back into SaaS. If your target market is like lawyers, in my example, there's a Facebook group that both Omeed and I participated. I kind of don't want to give away the idea because I'd love to acquire it. But like, there's a very active Facebook group that's got like 12 or 15,000 lawyers in it or something, 15,000 very active lawyers. It's like, why don't I acquire an audience that could benefit from my SaaS product and save myself hundreds of thousands of dollars of marketing spend, right? So I think like SaaS companies interested in M&A need to use that skill to think about it. Like, what are all the things that I can acquire that will help benefit my SaaS? And it's not always the entire other company. Sometimes it's just like taking over the admin and administration of a Facebook group.
I'm definitely, yeah, I hear you. I'm definitely getting the sense from you that you're going to become a shopping addict because there's so many different ways of potentially buying assets or other strap-ons to the business in a really positive and creative way. And I agree with what you're saying there. That makes a lot of sense, especially again with your marketing background. You know, Facebook groups, those are something you could leverage, and you have the creativity and knowledge to leverage. Whereas me, for example, like I'd be like, what would I do with that? Because I'm, you know, my expertise is, you know, legal practice.
Sure. For the SaaS owners out there, like, you know, a SaaS review, a well-ranked SaaS review site that's generating, you know, millions of visits a month. Like, why not acquire that and leverage it as a marketing asset for you? Like, I don't, as long as it's aligned, don't get distracted, you know, like start acquiring, I don't know, like laundromats or something like that. Maybe that's a good investment. Maybe I don't know anything about that, but like, you know, I mean, there's lots of related stuff that you can go shopping for using the same M&A skill and kind of working with guys like you who get the business and help enable a business owner or investor like me to go out and shop and acquire those things.
That makes sense. Oh, I'm sure Omeed's taking a mental note of that there.
I've been about the acquisition of Facebook groups. Email newsletters are also great too. You know, those are popping. Instagram accounts as well. Like, so many Instagram accounts that like are inactive, you know, that are just sitting there with thousands of followers that can be reactivated. If that's something that, yeah, as you said, I think, you know, intentionality is incredibly important. Understanding roadmap, like understanding how to integrate the asset, reactivate it, so on and so forth. Having a plan in those respects is so important. So talk to us a little bit about that. Actually, I think we're now kind of like in the integration phase, though. I would really quickly like to touch on, like, what did the process of acquiring that SaaS business look like? Did you submit an LOI? What did due diligence look like? How long did that? I hear that you got ghosted for a period of time. Like, what was the like total timeline from initial conversation to close, and what did the kind of steps in that process look like?
It was almost exactly a year. So it was a really great conversation. And then ghosted because he was exploring this other opportunity. I didn't take it personal, whatever, right? Like, people change their mind all the time. And this is why we just keep on looking, you know, and some of these are going to go through, some of them won't. I will say one bit of advice before I go through more of the detail that you're asking about, Omeed, is like, don't ever feel FOMO when you're shopping, right? When you're acquiring, don't ever feel FOMO. It's going to be the worst thing that happens to you. Be okay with walking away from any deal. Don't ever feel like, oh, I have to have this deal. There'll never be a deal like it. There's always another deal. So
have you ever felt FOMO though?
Well, yeah, you're, you know, of course you get excited about a thing and you really want it. And especially if you're an entrepreneur, you're driven. You're like, I gotta win, right? You know, and so that's danger. You need to like keep a clear head and be okay with walking away from a deal.
Has there been something that like you have experienced where you felt FOMO and it like harmed you in some way where you learned this lesson? Is there like a core lesson there? It sounds like an important one.
It is an important one, but fortunately for me, I've met a really successful entrepreneur who taught me this lesson early on. Before I became an investor, before I started M&A, he was actually a real estate investor, and he was saying, like, if you're going to do real estate investment, you have to be able to walk away from a deal when you discover, like, you pull up the flooring and, you know, infestation, whatever. He's like, there's always another deal. Don't ever get it. So I always took that to heart, and it hasn't impacted me yet in a negative way. So getting back to the deal details, we had this conversation, ghosted me. And then, like, the answer is always no if you don't ask, right? You know, my mom taught me that one. And so, like, almost a year to the date, I emailed this dude again. I was like, hey, you know, whatever happened, I don't necessarily concerned dragging that out, but I'm wondering, like, whatever happened, like, are you still interested? And he's like, his response was, your email couldn't have been more perfect timing. He goes, I'm scheduled to shut this down in 5 days. I'm like, I mean, I was 5 days away from kind of losing the opportunity, and just happened to be like a follow-up. Like, I can't remember. It wasn't like a scheduled CRM entry. I think I was still plugging away at like Fixie or something. And I was like, whatever happened to that guy? I'm going to email him. And I did that. And, like, you know, when he had customers and we were originally having that discussion, you could imagine the price is one price point. But now that he's 5 days away from shutting it down,
yeah, you were just about to trash the asset.
Yes, exactly. So, you know, that's so much out of the trash, price, right? So, like, I think, you know, when you think about these deals, you just, like, you know, the ones that are interesting to you, just keep on working them, keep on nurturing them. Some will go someplace, some won't. That's okay. So what we did from there was like, hey, well, I'm still interested. Let's get on the phone. Let's at least make sure we're in the ballpark, right? So this is the two business people having a conversation about what we consider value, what's important to us, right? And so, you know, it was pretty clear, like, he was done with this. Like, he wanted to throw in the towel. He was hoping to at least have his work have some meaning. Like, he was interested in seeing it stay alive, because he put in a lot of work, right? That's always important to some business owners. So, you know, of course, we're going to keep it alive. We might rebrand it, but, you know, it's the core or whatever. The other thing was, like, he also didn't want to support it, right? But so we had to kind of figure this. It's like, hey, you know, I can't just take this over. I need some support, but we'll make it easy on you. And we carved out, like, what if it was 2 hours? What if we did milestone payments? What if I pay you up front, sign of good faith, you know, and all that sort of thing. So we talked through those terms. Because of the size of the deal, I know you guys are going to frown when I get to this part. But because of the size of the deal, and we decided, like, if we could avoid using lawyers at this point, just for speed, number one.
Oh my gosh.
It's not okay. It's not okay.
I know. And you guys are right. You guys are right. And I totally rolled the dice on this one. I'm not recommending your audience do this, but I'll tell you part of why. And I actually learned this at LegalZoom. The fastest way to kill a deal, like, between two business owners, is to either bring in a lawyer or, excuse me, let me take that back. Bring in a broker, right? Business broker, or an untrained lawyer, or a lawyer without the business mindset. And I don't think that's you guys, by the way. So I think everybody should be calling you guys to put their deals together. And I wish, Omeed, that's why I told you, like, I wish I knew you, like, more, like, at that time, because at LegalZoom, we'd put these deals together, and they'd bring it, the other side bring in a lawyer and just redline everything and just tell you no. And what we're saying, it's like, hey, this deal is done. We actually don't want your, you know, your advice. That we want your help in enabling it. Of course, keep us from walking off a cliff, you know, but, like, don't just say no. Help us a creative way of, like, working around that issue, right? And really great M&A lawyers that get that, they're business enablers. They speed up the deal. They actually don't drag it down. But it's so hard to find, like, lawyers with a great business mindset like you two. And it's a little scary for a business owner. Like, I don't want a lawyer come in here and tell me this is all effed up, right? This is wrong. You guys are going to like, you know, we're talking about, you know, a 5-figure transaction, right? Like we're not like, you know, talking like $1 million deal. And so, you know, anyway, so we rolled the dice.
Get it.
I sent out you guys get it, right? Okay.
It's not the first time we've heard it out.
I know.
I was just, I'm busting your chops a bit there because we do hear it
so much.
Yeah, but
it's important.
This is why your podcast is great, because you're creating awareness, and like now people know, you know, again, like I would have preferred to work with lawyers. I just didn't know any that are deal enablers rather than deal killers, right? So that's why. So forgive me, and I recommend everybody use a lawyer 100% of the time, but that's what I did in this case.
Fully with you there.
All right. So LOI went out just to kind of document the promises that we made to each other. We agreed on those. And then, you know, we kind of piecemealed some agreements together. We used practical instruments. It was like, some of it was built on trust. We're like, hey, I'm going to wire you this percentage of this payment, and then we'll do this, that, and the other. But like, we had really spent a lot of time reassuring each other that, you know, we're creating a win-win. And so there was very little, it wasn't like a zero-sum game. I'm not trying to one-up him. I want him to make money. That's why we carved out like, hey, you continue to service this client. You know, he wants this product to live with me, and he thought it'd be better hands with me. So it worked out in that case, but it was a risk. My second acquisition was a bigger deal amount and 100% used lawyers. Fortunately for the seller, they had a business-minded M&A lawyer that they used, and they were just like, we'll just do it for you. Put the deal together. Very simple agreement, very simple process.
Cool. I definitely want to jump in and talk about that other deal too, just to kind of hear all the lessons learned and everything there. I feel like I have a pretty clear picture of this SaaS acquisition and, you know, your intentions moving forward in the SaaS space. So while I'm sure there's still a few other questions rumbling around in my head, I feel pretty good where we're at on that subject. How about you, Omeed?
Yeah. If you have something else and you want to take it in another direction, bring it through, Joe.
No, I mean, the only thing I'd mention, I'd do a little shout out to, is I feel like, even though I wasn't there present for your discussions with the seller, that engineer, I feel like you're really keyed into how to talk with a founder seller regarding the acquisition or the sale of his business, of an engineering founder seller, I mean, because it's definitely a different experience and different culture than your typical seller. And I feel like that, just to call out this subject, I feel like that's really important for founder sellers out there to take into mind, that, hey, when they talk to potential buyers, they may not be people that can communicate with them really well. They may be those type of people, and there's going to be a fit or not regarding whether or not you can have a trust-based relationship with the buyer. And similarly, though, PE experts know this well, especially SaaS ones, because very often they've worked with engineers a lot before. But it's different than, for example, a real estate buyer dealing with real property sellers. There's just really a different cultural and conversational dynamic there that is hugely impactful on whether or not you can even get a deal, and if you can get terms that are going to be constructive for both sides. So I feel like that's something we didn't speak to directly, but was present in this transaction.
Yeah, that's right. I think the best deals, both parties really feel like they're winning, right? And both parties really feel like they were heard. Because again, like I started with, what's working for me is helping them solve a problem that they're stuck at. You know, and that could be anything, growth, retirement, all this stuff. And to do that, you have to leverage empathy. You have to really get to know them, and you have to really be sincere. You have to really be sincere about wanting to help them, and they have to feel like you are helping them, right? Like you're helping them out from under this thing. And in so many ways, like right or wrong, this is probably a separate conversation, but sometimes we entrepreneurs feel like our businesses define us, right? And I don't agree that's true, but we invest so much time. We sometimes have to prioritize our business over our families, right? You know, like travel, things of that nature. And so it becomes part of our identity, and it's part of our legacy. And like, we have to just kind of understand that, like as a purchaser, right? Like you have to understand that that seller probably has some deep emotional ties to that business. We have to respect that. We have to communicate effectively to reach them.
Yeah, 100%. You even bring to mind one I can't remember too many details, but there was this one transaction I was an attorney on for the buyer, and they had basically communicated to the seller, hey, we're going to chop it up and we're going to use this one thing. And the seller got extremely upset. Now, they were being transparent and everything, but on the other hand, maybe it could have been communicated or planned in a more productive way. And it was so long, this was several years ago. It was so long ago, I can't recall whether or not it killed the transaction. My mind says it did, but I'm not gonna state that. I can't remember fully.
Yeah, and I don't think we have to be dishonest, right? Like in that case, you know, maybe the conversation is like, hey, you know, you've been running this business as a whole, but have you considered maybe if we could, you know, disintegrate some of the parts and then perpetuate it in other categories? So now there's more reach, and all the magic that you created, that was this whole piece. Now we take out this little magic and we put it there. We take out this little magic, put it there, right? So like, in other words, we're going to chop up the business and like use it elsewhere. But like it's a different way of communicating the same, right? Like it's 100%. A different way of looking at it, you know. And for that business owner that you're buying that from, they haven't thought of it that way. And they might actually be excited about that potential if you've communicated it correctly.
Yeah, 100%. There's definitely a big communication thing there. And it's not about trying to be like, oh, I just want them to think about it this way. That's not it at all. It's just about getting alignment and making sure everybody's on the same page and has a positive intention moving towards and beyond closing. And it definitely sounds like here in this SaaS transaction that you did, that you were able to identify, oh, he's going to stop providing the SaaS service, and he would like that service to keep on living, most likely, because he spent so much time building it.
Yep, that's right.
And then what did the process like? Has it gone the way that you expected? Has the process of integration gone the way that you expected? Are you hitting your forecast numbers? Like, what did you learn in the process of operating that SaaS business? Because that was pretty much your first acquisition, right? So
yeah, my first SaaS acquisition for sure. And I would say, even though like, so Tony's my primary engineer, it's a Ruby stack. We built it on, he's fluent Ruby, you know, all that sort of thing. I would say that one thing that I would have done differently is I would have probably spent a little bit more time researching bugs. So I would have probably signed up as a user and kind of used it more frequently. I kind of didn't do that. I like followed it as, you know, the demo version with the engineers support, like the product expert is kind of leading through the support, did all that. And I did tinker with it a little bit, but I didn't like push live transactions through and all that sort of thing. And in hindsight, that would have been more helpful for me for planning purposes. Like it wouldn't have changed the outcome of the purchase because, you know, he was very transparent. Hey, there's bugs. So all software has bugs, you know, and whether they have been discovered or not. So it wouldn't have changed the outcome of the purchase, but it would have helped me plan better. And so when we integrated and we took over, it's been, I would say we're like 3 months behind schedule of where we had hoped it'd be, because we had to ramp up more familiarity. And then now we've discovered, like, I understood why he showed me a certain workflow, but now that we've actually have actual customers and transactions pushing through, we want to change the workflow now. And then now, after the 6 months of support has lapsed, now we're having to go back to, you know, the original architect to figure out some logic. So yeah, so definitely use the software that you're buying, right? The SaaS, like push live transactions to interview customers, you know, like talk to customers if the seller is open to you doing that. All of that. I would do better due diligence, and certainly, you know, like more diligence, more like, you know, the bigger the transaction, obviously. But for SaaS specifically, like be the customer going through the product itself. So that way you get everything from the user experience, the bugs, the transactions, and the value proposition.
I love that. No, that's a really great lesson learned to call out there. And so you had used it to some extent, but nonetheless, if you were to go back, you know, hindsight is 2020, right? I mean, what we do about that. But if you were to go back, or in your next one, it sounds like you're going to do more due diligence from that use perspective, and, you know, talking to other customers.
Yeah, I would secret shop it. I would have my wife sign up for an account or something, right? Like, and just kind of go through it. Like, so it wasn't, we had used it always on the back end, because there's the technologists and product people. That's what we were most excited about. So we were using that part of it. And I mean, it seems obvious. I bet this seems very obvious to your audience, right? Like, what do you mean you didn't care so much about the user experience, right? The front end. But I'm not talking just like the UI, the user interface. I'm talking about the actual, hey, I just put my credit card in. How long does it take for me to get that postmark email in my inbox, confirmation, all the stuff? Or when's the renewal period 1 month into the thing in a live environment, rather than having it explained? That's different.
At the time of acquisition, was it just the founder? How many people were on staff? How many users?
Just the founder. And I think that's part of what made it a sweet deal. He was just burnt out, right? Like, right. I think at one point he had, you know, some help, but, you know, he was tech support, he was sales, he was here, like he was all of that. And so, you know,
And go ahead, Joe.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, and so post acquisition, have you implemented an operator and, you know, implemented like a marketing strategy, either product led growth or sales led growth? And what does that look like?
Yeah. So now we're live. You go to simpleclient.com. You can check that out. We haven't done kind of a large scale marketing campaign, because there are still a couple of features that, again, based on hindsight, that we would have maybe prioritized first, but we're a little 3 months behind schedule. But it's live. We have customers. We just feel before we spend a little bit more marketing dollars, we kind of want to put the finishing touches on some of these things. But we now are at a point where we're not so much addressing issues or bugs, and more like focusing on the product roadmap and the improvements. And that'll be a perpetual cycle. We don't want to hold off on marketing forever, right, to get those things dialed in. But we have our product roadmap now. We're down to, I think, like 2 outstanding small bug issues, you know, that we're working on this week. And for the legal industry, unfortunately, you know, if you don't get it out before Thanksgiving, it's just dead until the next year. And so we're probably, you know, that's just the legal industry, right? And so we're probably going to be coming very close to that Thanksgiving thing. So I think we're not going to be spending marketing, doing press release, doing all this stuff until like January of this coming year.
That makes sense. No, I mean, that's how the launch cycle can go. By the way, I also have 2 things to call out for you on the future SaaS transactions that you could do. It sounds like you may not have here, but, you know, you were saying there, hey, you would have used it a little bit more, just to check it out. Totally get that. It makes sense. But also other things you could keep in mind, other people out there could keep in mind, are you could look at the customers. Maybe they didn't have too many customers or too much of a history, but you could look at the customer support history. That might also evidence bugs or other issues you need to be aware of. And secondly, and I'm sure you're aware of this too, you could engage a technical due diligence expert who could much quicker than you get on the app and identify even more bugs than you may be able to identify yourself. And those can obviously range in prices, and it may not have even been applicable for this transaction. But that's definitely something to keep in mind, because then you'll get a formal report, and you'll be able to lean on the advice of an expert in the type of language or whatever type of app. The way that SaaS target was developed, you can lean on their expertise, and that'll help you plan timing and costs moving forward also.
Yeah, that's right. And I would also add some of the things that I did know to check where there are a few integrations with other industry products that kind of add value. And so I did contact some of those companies to see what was the standing of that company. Like, you know, are they current on bills? Like, have they had any red flags on API utilization or violated any code or things like that? Because, you know, at least for my product, it integrates with like LawPay as an example. And so the last thing I need is for LawPay to say, oh, you know, like we're going to cancel your API access because you violated something, right? So like, yeah, you have to kind of run through those. But again, this is why working with people who do this for a living, like you too, for us, like entrepreneurs, we might get caught up in the excitement of the deal. And that's where a business lawyer, you're not saying no, you're just like, hey, let's just do this smart. Like here's our checklist of all the things that we've got to go through, because you mentioned a couple of things that I didn't do on that deal either.
Yeah, no, definitely. I like what you did there, though, is do some due diligence on the other API integrations or other businesses they're working with in general. That's definitely very thoughtful too. It would have sucked to have acquired the assets or whatever and learned, oh, they have a past due bill, and they've been, like for e-commerce stores, a big issue is if Amazon's already given them a few red flags about their flagship products. Yeah. That's obviously a huge issue. So yeah, you know, I feel really complete on the subject of talking about this acquisition. You know, why don't we move on and talk about the other one? I also want to call out time here. So why don't we take a step back and think about anything else we're going to want to discuss besides that second SaaS target? Do we want to spend some more time and talk about the perspective of your passion? And maybe we can even edit this part out, whatever, I don't care. The perspective of your passion for access to justice and your mission there. Are there some other subject matter besides that second acquisition that we should ensure we touch on before we hit the hour 30, hour 45 mark?
You know, the second acquisition might be a benefit to your audience. Edit this part out as you please, because it was like a Canadian company and they had employees, and there was like this. Anyway, why don't we talk about that? Like, yeah, because I think there's some lessons. Yeah, I think there's some lessons for your audience there.
Cool. Okay, let's do it.
I'm happy to talk about that. But okay, so it sounds like that's really going to be the last topic for our call today. Did either of you come to this call with the intention of discussing anything else? Because I don't want to lead us to a close and have left what you guys wanted to talk about on the table.
Not on my end. No. I'm enjoying this. Yeah.
Okay, cool. No, I actually think it's super on point, and I think the conversation is going really well. I don't have anything else to raise either. Maybe even we could as we lead to the, I'm like contorting my face there. As we lead to the end, maybe we could bring it, or we'll give you a moment as we wrap up the second acquisition subject, and maybe you could tie it all together with your passion and about maybe your future inclination, the things you're doing next, because I feel like that gives us a good narrative for the podcast, which was, hey, you did some of these acquisitions and this is the direction you're going in the future. Does that make sense? Just from a narrative perspective, I think that's a good way to take us through the end. All right, well, let's go ahead and do it then. Let's go ahead and dive into that second acquisition. Why don't we throw the mic over to Alan, Alan, and tell us what happened.
Yeah, so the second acquisition was Divorce Marketing Group. And so they're another service agency, but they had some digital assets that I wanted that aligned with my portfolio that I explained. They were a Canadian-based company. And so one of the things that I think I learned in kind of doing this, it's like doing business in Canada from a regulatory and then like employer kind of standpoint is much different than the US. And even though California, where I'm based, is, you know, not always as friendly to employers as it is to employees, that sort of thing. In Canada, it's like 2x California and stuff. So we knew we wanted the company, but I didn't want to run a Canadian business, right? And so we had to kind of think of ways of doing that. And I will say this, this is one of the tough parts of acquisition, is when people are involved, right? Sometimes you have to make these tough decisions. And so when you're negotiating these deals, you got to be clear to the buyer that, like, don't tell your employees yet, right? Because we may need some key employees. So we have to look through HR records. We have to understand what the roles are and everything, right? So that way we bring over key people, and that we bring them in when necessary in the conversation, when the deal's like, 90% there, then you can bring in those key employees, and you might even want to consider working in some upside for them as part of the negotiation, because again, if they're key players in the success of the business, they've got to come along. But so when I was doing this acquisition divorce marketing group, there were a number of people that weren't key players, and if we kept them on, it would not be fun running two international, like one in the United States, one in Canada. So we had to make a tough decision. And we couldn't really kind of tell people up front, which I know sucks, right? Like, but this is the reality. This is part of like what makes, this part of the deal the hardest, because human beings are involved. So, what we did is we negotiated the terms. We were very clear, like, hey, these people aren't coming. These assets are coming. There's a key person that wasn't in Canada. They were actually in the United States. So they're coming, right? And things of that nature. But we worked it out with the seller, where they were going to kind of figure out what it's required to let people go in Canada, right? Like, they're going to handle that, and then we're going to take over everything. So we that was part of like what you have to consider. Like, most of our discussion has been about like the assets, the digital product, the migration, all the stuff, right? But like human beings too. Yeah. And so if you're shopping for businesses, by the way, and you're sending out direct mail, keep in mind that there might be a receptionist type person who's opening that mail. And if he says, I'd like to buy your business, that person's reading it, spreading those rumors around the office, right? Or around the company. So you might want to put private confidential for business owner only, or something, at least on the letter, right? Is something. And just keep in mind, you want key people. You might have to make tough decisions about letting people go. And it's best to do them as part of the to do those breakups as part of the transaction, because otherwise you inherit some of the liabilities too when it comes to terminating somebody. And what if they have a wage and hour claim that you're unaware of, right? And like, now they work for you, like you close the deal today and tomorrow they work for you, and then you terminate them, and now they have a wage and hour claim against you, right? Like, I guess you guys are the lawyers, you can tell me, but there's probably some way to try and get it back from the seller or something, like to structure it, right, where they hold some responsibility for some time. But like, you've just borne this headache and like 2 years of fighting with the plaintiff's firm and all that stuff, right? So those are things that are very important.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'd like to shout out there how you just knew that. Oh wait, quick pause.
Alan, I got a message from you saying that you have about 5 minutes. Do you have to go?
Yeah, I just sent a Slack, so we can wrap it up. But yeah,
that's fine. We can make this not as long-winded as the first acquisition, and we could do this in 5 minutes.
Yep.
That's fine.
Sounds good.
Cool.
Yeah, let's do it. I'm just gonna kind of get my eye on the clock. All right, and so I'm gonna go back to what I was gonna say now. So what I was saying there was that, let me just kind of get my flow back, was that one thing I really like about what you're calling out here, the employee side, sure, those issues, I'll mention that in a moment. But as a preliminary, as an initial matter, you knew that it was going to be a headache to turn your business into an international business with multiple regulatory regimes and all the headache that comes with that. So often we see people excited about international deals. I mean, we've done international deals before, and I'm not saying they're not exciting, but it's only if applicable.
Yes.
It's only, it's not just about expanding internationally. Oh, we have this great talent in Canada, we have to keep them. That is definitely not the case at all. I very often am a big fan of keeping things simple. Keep all your operations local. Don't, like I always like to use a refrain, an anecdote of WhatsApp when it sold for whatever billion and it had 19 staff and they were all local. That operation must have been really smooth and easy to manage. But if you go on and you're already dealing with Canadian employment laws, employment law is not only not the funnest thing, but it's also one of those areas where it's sensitive. It's with people you don't want to mess around. And there's so many little rules everywhere. California has its rules. All the states have their rules. So I love how you just knew upfront that, okay, I'm not going to overcomplicate this business, because that headache could get you for years. I've made that mistake before. A lot of people have made that mistake. And so I love that. And then secondly, yeah, I agree with your empathetic and personal touch as to considering the seller's employees. And, you did keep at least one employee on afterwards, and that type of empathetic connection with that remaining employee and just the general conversation is totally necessary to even get the good faith of that remaining employee, because otherwise they'll constantly think, oh no, am I next? And you might be like, what are you talking about? I didn't let you go. Like, you're not next. But that's not how employees think in the context of an acquisition. And so having that of the people who are carried over, having that trust is absolutely essential. And I think that's another great takeaway from what you're saying there. Why don't we go ahead and touch on a few other lessons learned from that acquisition, and then we can go ahead and carry ourselves towards the close of this conversation.
Yeah, sounds great.
So Omeed, well, why don't you throw out a question there about that acquisition so we could dig a little deeper in some information on it that might be useful.
Yeah, so it sounds like it was a cross-border transaction. How did you find that? Did you tell us how you found it?
Consulting. So I was doing some work, with divorce.com, and they had originally acquired the company, and through discussions with them, I realized, like, hey, there were certain things that they wanted from this organization and certain things that that came with the deal that they didn't necessarily care for. So we kind of figured out, who should get what, solve that problem for them. Like, hey, I don't want to run an agency. Great. I'm happy to run an agency. Sell it to me.
Okay. How did you use an independent private expert to value the business and come to terms on the valuation? Did you just spitball a number? Was it a back and forth? How did the valuation go?
We set up a deal where we both bear the risk, right? So we set up a deal where, they said, like, here's how much revenue it generates every year. Here's what the cost. They just kind of showed us a P&L basically, and they said, here's what we think it's worth. And, I said, like, I don't think it's worth that much. Like, and we kind of went through, went a couple of rounds of that. And then where we settled was like, it really came down to financing. So they financed it, right? But we carved out, the financing was really kind of based on the book of business. And so if we would lose some of that business, they would also kind of lose some of that. They would basically knock it off the selling price ultimately, right? And so, there was kind of trust that we would help grow the business and they'd get full value that they wanted. But in the event that we didn't, the value would drop with that. And then we put a certain time period. Payments will continue up to this period. Minimum annual payments until either paid in full or we all decided, hey, it's not worth pursuing anymore. So everybody's kind of bearing some of the risk, but it also made it easy to finance and close and be flexible. So
yeah. One thing we often see is with our clients on the buy side, if they have that conundrum on the pricing, I'm always trying to do hand gestures, but it never fits in the
podcast. Yeah, I know. Same.
I'm like, and they have that problem. We even have one deal right now that this just popped up on. That's the approach that you took is definitely the way to do it. So we might have a gap on the valuation. Let's think of some other terms that could enable us to get what the price we want, or on some similar terms, but also de-risk the fact that we don't think it's worth that much. So like you're saying, I don't know the full specifics there, but like you're saying, maybe it's contingent on some future performance, the
yes.
price is.
Yeah.
So that's definitely something. Yeah, it's, I'd say it's very similar to just being creative about financing generally. But on the other hand, people get very sticky about price and they don't want to be creative sometimes around the terms because they're like, well, this is what it's worth. And that's, the language of the terms, it gets more complicated than that. It's really not just about that ultimate number. So it's really important to keep open-minded about what the whole package looks like, the terms package looks like together.
Yeah, like if you were going to buy a plumbing company and they had like 10 trucks and you realize like there's only enough work for 5 trucks, you could say, hey, you're asking for, I don't know, 100 grand, right? Just to make easy math. I'll tell you what, why don't you keep these 5 trucks? You can resell them. I just did Kelly Blue Book. They're worth at 15,000 each, right? Now I'll pay you, 65 grand. Or something like that, right? Like, so there's always ways that like, you could kind of figure this out. You just have to be creative. You have to look at where the costs are, where the opportunities are. Make sure that your suggestions always align with their desired outcome too, like that sort of thing. But there's always a way to kind of figure this out.
No, 100%. That creative thinking is absolutely essential. Constructive thinking is what I meant to say, but same thing really. So, for timing considerations, why don't we go ahead and lean towards the exit? Omeed, do you want to walk us through that?
Yeah. So to bring this conversation to a close, I'll ask you for the biggest learning lesson from that second acquisition, kind of like a tip of the day quip, like a little 1 minute, kind of short, punchy soundbite in terms of what you learned primarily, from the second acquisition, because I feel like we got the learning lesson from the first one. That was a big one. It was like do more code side due diligence. Mm-hmm. And I would love to kind of get like a punchy lesson from the second acquisition in terms of the primary learning lesson where you walked away and you were like, oh, I should have done this or whatever.
And sorry to
go ahead.
It might be one of the things you already said. You might be like, hey, if you cut the employees, international, do it.
I know what it is. I'll tell you guys what it is. So
let's let Omeed ask.
Yeah. So that we can do the setup because it looks better for the social media video. But just to finish the orientation, and then once you do your tip of the day, we'll just move into hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us on another episode of SaaS Buyers Club. I'm your host Omeed. Joe will go, I'm your host Joe, and then you'll go, I'm Alan, and then you can do a plug. You can find me on LinkedIn, Facebook, wherever you want people to find you, and then whatever you want to plug, if there is anything at all.
Like you could say, whoever your target, if you're an attorney out there that needs, whatever you want to, you have a marketing soundbite, basically is what it means. Yeah.
Sure.
Yep. And then we'll be like, yeah, thanks everyone. And then we'll hit end recording, sit here for a few minutes. And then, just appreciate you having you here with us, Alan.
Cool. Love it.
Cool.
Thank you guys. It's been fun.
Absolutely. It's been a lot of fun. A lot of fun.
Okay. Go on, Omeed. Take us through.
Awesome. Yeah. So Alan, thanks so much for sharing that story of your second acquisition. What would you say your tip of the day for our listeners would be?
So in the case of the second acquisition was like, if you're acquiring a business that you're going to incorporate into your existing business, unlike acquiring a business that's going to stand alone, if you're acquiring one to integrate into your existing business, 2x the amount of time you think it's going to take to do that. So if you think, hey, I'll have this whole, new team culture integrated within 3 months, to exit at a minimum, and know that when it comes to the people side of the business, the technology stuff is always going to move faster. But when it comes to the people side of the business, that's a different thing, because they're forming a whole new culture, right? A whole new way of doing things, a whole new reporting system. And that's where your friction is going to be. Whenever there's human beings involved, when you're not just buying like digital assets or something like that, software license, whatever, then just know that that's going to be the biggest issue. And so, be patient, be empathetic, right? And understand that you're transforming culture. And then for context, keep in mind, how long did it take me to build my team culture at my own business, right? And think about it. You're asking people to just come in and the very next day try to learn it, right? So just be patient. That would be my takeaway there on the integration side. My tip of the day.
Yeah, we can do a whole nother hour on that. So we'll definitely have to have you back on the show,
All
Alan.
Right.
Awesome.
We'll see how many acquisitions you do by this time next year, because you're on a roll so far. But yeah, man, thanks so much for joining us this week. Really appreciate you having you on the show.
Yeah, thanks.
And everyone out there. No, that's cool. It's cool. Everyone out there, thanks so much for joining us for another episode of SaaS Buyers Club. I'm your host, Omeed.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And thank you so much, Alan. And I'm your co-host, Joe.
And listen, Omeed and Joe, I really appreciate being on the show. I think I had a lot of fun. I think you guys are two wonderful lawyers doing this for the benefit of the SaaS audience out there. So please keep up the good work. And then I'll say, if anybody in the legal tech space is interested in connecting with me, they can do so at 1400.com. That's ONE400.com. Or look me up on LinkedIn, Alan Rodriguez. I'm always looking for opportunities, whether they're consulting opportunities, acquisition, M&A opportunities, right, to work with other legal tech companies and lawyers for that matter. Yeah.
Awesome.
Very cool.
Thanks again, Alan. Appreciate it.
All right.
Thanks, Alan.
Cool.
See ya, everyone, next week.